Thank you, Andrew. I just want to thank the organisers of the Social Summit. It's fantastic to have so many people from different backgrounds here to sort of talk around the SDGs and the challenges that we face as Australia, particularly play our role in terms of both achieving the SDGs in Australia but also globally. I thought I'd just building on what Andrew said, a little bit more background, I guess, in my role is I work for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. My role is as a humanitarian coordinator, which really means that I advise the government, Foreign Minister Bishop, on how we respond to global humanitarian crises. So that includes how we respond to things like natural disasters with Cyclone Winston in Fiji or Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu, but also how we respond to a lot of the conflict, protracted crises like the devastating situations in Syria, South Sudan, Central African Republic, Iraq, etc. And also within my division, we sort of manage the volunteers program, which I'll put a quick pitch on, which is where we deploy about 1,500 volunteers, Australian volunteers overseas every year. And I imagine there's probably some in this room who have either been volunteers themselves or if they haven't, should think about taking the opportunity up of being an Australian Volunteers for International Development, because it is a great way of, with the Australian government, with community organisations overseas, actually making a very tangible contribution to the SDGs. So look, with the time I've got, I really wanted to sort of, I guess, talk a little bit about the current humanitarian landscape that we face today. Some of the emerging trends that are developing and what that might mean for how we do or don't achieve the SDGs. And then I sort of want to talk a little bit about the importance of us taking a much more stronger focus on investing before and investing after crises. We hear a lot about the during and the devastation of situations as a result of natural disasters or the situations at the moment with refugees, Syrian refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, etc. But we don't really often hear about or look at how can we better invest and focus on the before side and how can we better engage on the after. And then I briefly want to leave a little challenge for all of you, but particularly some of the younger people in the room who hopefully will take up leadership roles in the near future, either in the non-government sector or in the government or private sector or academia. So look, just on the humanitarian landscape, and probably a number of the figures that I'll quickly go through, you'll have probably heard of, and I don't want to necessarily focus on too much, but I think it is important to understand where are we at today in terms of historical humanitarian environment, and what are some of the trends that are emerging for us that is really going to potentially shape how well we globally support people achieving the SDGs. So one of the biggest challenges we face at the moment is just the number of people displaced. We've got 65 million people displaced globally today. That is a 10% increase from the year before, which was 60 million. And so you've clearly got a trend, we've clearly got a trend of increasing amount of people being displaced, either a result of conflict, either a result of impacts of climate change and natural disasters. There's 26 million people displaced every year as a result of natural disasters. That can be a result of weather-related issues. It could be as a result of droughts. It could be as a result of earthquakes. And that translates to one person every second. So in the time that I've been here already, we've already had well over 400 or 500 people have been displaced as a result of natural hazards or natural disasters, which climate change we know is having an increasing impact on. The amount of humanitarian need that is required to meet this needs of the number of displaced people has more than a five-fold increase over the last decade, from $3.7 billion in 2005 to $20.1 billion today. So you can see both in terms of the impacts of conflict and displacement, the trends that are emerging, the increasing demand on funding that's needed to meet need, and the other big issue obviously is the impact that climate change is already having and will continue to have into the future. I was talking to one of my CSIRO colleagues the other day about the climate change issue, and he highlighted to me one of the biggest things that doesn't get talked about is acknowledging that climate change will have increasing impacts on certain events. We're potentially going to have more intense and regular cyclones in the Pacific and in other regions. You've probably heard about Hurricane Matthew in Haiti. It had a devastating impact a week ago. We're potentially going to have impacts like slow onset crisis like droughts, the El Nino impacts that are hitting southern Africa and the Horn of Africa at the moment. But what he pointed out is that you could say in the past those events may happen 1 in 6 times. So every time you roll a dice, it'll happen once. You get a weather-related incident, and you roll the dice again, 1 in 6 it would happen for a drought issue. And if you multiply those together, that means those issues potentially happening together is about 1 in 36. And what he said, well, what is emerging with climate change is the risks of climate-related impacts as a result of cyclones or sudden onset crises is moving to 1 in 3. We've seen that. We've had 2 of the biggest cyclones that have ever gone through the South Pacific in the last 2 years, hitting Vanuatu and Fiji. And slow onset crises like the El Nino that impacted the Pacific, East Timor, as I mentioned, Horn of Africa, and that 1 in 3. So if you multiply those together, 1 in 3 times 1 in 3, you get 1 in 9. And his point really is that we're not just dealing with certain incidents happening more and more acutely, but we're potentially having conflating issues going at the same time over top of each other. And a good example of that, with my role as the Australian Humanitarian Coordinator, is we had to deal with the Cyclone Winston issue in late February, early March that had a devastating impact on Fiji. But at the same time that was happening, we were dealing with a devastating El Nino impact that didn't get a lot of coverage in the media, but was impacting heavily on the Papua New Guinea, in Fiji itself, East Timor, and then Ethiopia, and as I mentioned at the moment, in Southern Africa. So I put the context out there because I think it's important that we do understand what we are facing today, and realising that if we don't find better ways to both deal with those crises, but also mitigate, prevent some of those issues emerging, we're going to go backwards on the SDGs. No matter how fantastic different investments are going to be made about development in approaches and programs, if we can't reverse the trend of the number of people being displaced, if we can't ensure communities are better positioned to deal with the impacts of climate change, then the steps that we take forward are going to be 2 steps back on some of these issues. So having sort of outlined that, I just briefly want to touch on some good news. I mean, it's always easy to sort of talk about the bad news and the issues that they're saying. What I want to talk about is we know what works. We know investing early in risk reduction pays dividends. There's communities in Bangladesh who have invested over the last decade or so on levees and that prevent the risks of cyclical floods that they know are going to be happening more and more regularly as a result of changes in weather patterns and whatever else. And many of those communities now are in a much better position to, one, prevent loss of harvest, but in many ways have actually started to use new science and technologies to actually improve the harvests they get, knowing what changes are emerging for their regions and crops into the future. We know investing in preparedness before disasters pays dividends. I talked about Cyclone Winston, Cyclone Pam, two of the biggest cyclones that ever have gone through the South Pacific. The first Cyclone Pam killed 10 people. Cyclone Winston killed 44 people. 54 people too many. But the relative mortality rate was a lot less than we've had in many lower impact crises before. Hurricane Matthew hit Haiti, killed over 1,000 people, and unfortunately is probably going to be increasing. And a lot of that is because Haiti, one of the poorest countries in the world, still struggles to get basic preparedness warning arrangements in place. So in Winston, we'd already worked closely with Australian government, Australian NGOs, humanitarian partners, to support communities to know where there's prepositioned supplies. So they had within their communities ability to access supplies. They had early warning systems that they had through their SMS, radio technologies, which allowed communities themselves to put their own practices in place and reduce the impacts of crises. We know in the recent floods in Myanmar that again didn't get a lot of coverage, that the investments that have been made about moving communities to pre-prepared evacuation areas or location centres, one, prevented a great deal of loss of life, but ensured that services such as basic health services that often when you get major floods can result in outbreaks of waterborne diseases could be reduced as services were able to be provided to those communities. They moved out of low-lying flooded areas, and then as they receded, were able to then move back, again reducing high losses of life from either health factors or disruptions in education for women, for girls or boys at key times. So the issue we know is that investing early makes a difference. In investing after, we know can lay a platform into the future. I'll give with time 2 quick examples. With Cyclone Winston, again, we've at the moment right now investing in rebuilding schools with the Fiji government, with the Ministry of Education, to ensure that the schools are going to be rebuilt to Category 4-5 resistant, which does 2 things. One of them, the schools are used as evacuation centres, so it ensures that there's a much safer environment for communities to move to. But it also is going to prevent the massive loss of loss of infrastructure of the education sector in Fiji that occurred after Winston. And so looking at how we better use the technologies, the resources that we've got today to build back better, using new building codes, ensuring that we can use technologies that of prefabricated housing is one of the critical things that we know we're going to be able to ensure that we become more resilient, communities are more resilient in response to crises. I want to finally leave you with a challenge, which is that I've worked for many years, I mentioned, in the NGO sector, worked for government now as a donor to many humanitarian agencies, and the architecture that we currently have in place, I believe, isn't fit to meet the need we have into the future. And what I mean by that is that the humanitarian sector is broadly established through a fairly top-down approach to dealing with a fairly grassroots bottom problem. And that means we have large global coordination funding appeals that are often driven in a very slow bureaucratic way. We've often got agencies that were established 50 to 60 years ago to deal with specific mandates. So agencies that deal with food security, the World Food Programme or UNHCR, and all agencies that do very good work, but they were established at a time to provide a specific service. And the technologies and shift in how we can provide assistance is moved dramatically. Most humanitarian assistance now meeting Syrian refugees isn't done through providing foods, putting up refugee camps, tents, etc. It's provided through cash. Refugees then make decisions about where they're going to rent, what services they're going to provide, how they're going to get access to schooling at Lebanon, Jordan, wherever else. And so the whole model is moving very quickly. And what I think it means is a rethink about how the donor community is utilising their resources, how international NGOs are moving from a fairly hierarchical head office, international network, local chapters in countries, to environments now where resources, the linkage between resources and information is much more driven straight from those that potentially are in a position to provide resources directly to those who are affected by a crisis. And the good news on this is there's a lot of technology and apps now where people can get information real time of what's happening with future forecasts of whether they know in the next 6 months what the trends are going to look like for their crops, for their harvest, and how we can link that information, that technology, with resources that allows them to then make the decisions that they need to either protect their food security, move their family to a safe environment, or mobilise their community to deal with a crisis. So the challenge I already put out there is that for many of you who are going to move into the business sector, move into potentially work for UN agencies, work for government, work for NGOs, the need for us to sort of shift this top-down, relatively bureaucratic structure to a much more sort of facilitating, connecting information to affected people is going to be one of the most critical factors to whether or not we can deal with the humanitarian challenges that we face now, but into the future. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the day.